Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Dan Cousins. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Bespoke Education. I'm also the head of tutoring. I've been a tutor. I'm so glad to have you here. We're continuing our webinar series. We've been going with these webinars since last summer, so for more than a year, really trying to answer the questions that everyone has on this road to college. There's a lot of information to be had. And here at Bespoke, we're really in the business of trying to get useful information out there to you all. So here we go. Today, we're doing the transition back to high school. I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a moment and walk you through some of the structure of what we're about to go through. But first, for those of you who are new to Bespoke or joining us after a while, I'm just going to talk you through a couple of the services that we offer, really give you a sense of the range of what we do here, because it's much more than just the academic coaching or just the mock testing. So I'm going to pull up our website. Here we go. Talk you through a couple things. We are a test prep company. It's worth noting that's how we started it, and that is still what we're doing. Tests to get you into high school, the IC, the SSAT, the SHSAT, tests to get you into college, the SAT and the ACT, and then tests for the graduate programs after that. We also do classes, and in addition to our own boot camps, our own programs, and there's actually a catalog of them up on our website right now, we work in partnership with numerous schools and organizations throughout the city and elsewhere to try to get this information out there in a more of a classroom setting, which some students find to be more suitable to their learning needs. We work with K through 5 students, which is a new thing for us starting last year. We have pods. We ran them last year. We may be running them again, and we're really endeavoring to get involved more in this part of the educational journey. We do mock testing. For those of you who have worked with us on standardized tests, or those of you who are looking ahead to work on standardized tests, the mock testing is a huge piece of that journey. You've got to practice these tests as you're going to play them. To use a sports metaphor, it's really true. So if you're going to be doing these tests, you want to be sitting down someplace and practicing them for 3.5 hours. And our program is an industry standard. We have remote testing and we have in-classroom testing, and we are offering this service not only to our own students, but even to other tutors, and other tutoring companies send their students to us for this. We have the webinars with which you're familiar. And if you go to our site, we actually have a back catalog of webinars available as videos. So if you missed one back then, there I am. You can see it yet again. So please check that out if you're curious. We also have a program called Bespoke Education Access, which is somewhat unusual for tutoring companies here in New York City. We're really working to live our values of helping to promote equality and access in education. So we work in partnership with numerous other organizations and schools to offer low and no cost tutoring and helpful seminars all throughout the city. So if you're interested in a program like that, or in partnership with your school or your organization, please do be in touch. Lastly, and firstly, we do tutoring. This is what we have really been working on for almost 20 years now. We started in New York City. We've realized this last year how much of a national reach and even an international reach we have, but still our focus is tutoring. We have been studying, we've been training our tutors, we've been training our partners in what it means to do great one-on-one work. And that's what we're here to talk about today. It's really all the ways that we have helped support students, not just with test prep, not just with math help or science help, but really in becoming a better student. And as we sat down to talk about today's webinar, we thought, this is going to be transition back to transition to high school from middle school. But then as we discussed it, we realized so much of what we were here to talk about was useful for students in so many grades. So we expanded it to this, we're going back to high school. It's a moment where some students are going back to school in person for the first time in a year. So there's a bunch to talk about. Here to help guide us through that, we've got 2 experts, Katie Patterson and Dorothy Wynn. I've worked with them for years. They're fantastic tutors, tons of experience with so many different kinds of students and working on so many different topics. Katie and Dorothy, thank you for joining us. I'm so glad to have you here. Can you please say a couple words about yourselves, just how long you've been with Bespoke, what you like to work on, and what you're working on these days with your students?
Sure. I'll start. My name's Katie Patterson. Years. I also have been teaching at FIT for the past couple of years, teaching in the science department there. And this year I'm going to be starting teaching 8th grade math at Schechter. And I really love working with all kinds of students. I think probably age 10 and up, I love working with. And in particular, I really like working on test prep as well as executive functioning stuff.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. Dorothy, how about you?
Hi, my name is Dorothy, and I've also been with Bespoke for 5 years so far. And I do a lot of tutoring, a lot of homework help, and standardized testing help, mostly math and science. Last year, I did a pod for fourth graders. And over the summer, I did an SAT prep class in lieu with Boys Hope, Girls Hope, which is what Dan was talking about before. And I'm really excited to talk about the executive functioning aspect.
Absolutely. It's worth noting, I've been with Bespoke Education since the fall of 2006 in a variety of roles, learning about tutoring, both for the tests and also just working with students on how to do this whole school thing better. And that's what we're here to talk about today. So a thing we've gotten a lot of calls about is how can I set my student up for success? And that's the first piece of what we're going to talk about, is just what you can do, what systems you can put in place for the year coming up, and even as the year begins, to really start to grapple with how to be a good student, how to be a better student. A lot of it comes down to habits and behaviors, and we're really going to dig into that in this first part of today's seminar. So this question, what can we do to set ourselves up for success? Katie, you're going to take the first stab at it. Can you please share your perspective?
Sure. I think that what we're going to be talking about today in general, I feel like it's going to be related to like digital organization, as well as how to, hold your own in the classroom, and then different ways to build community as a family. But I think to kick us off, I'd like to talk a little bit about, I don't know if you can hear, my son is reacting to a cartoon, which, occasionally happens when I am teaching. Hang
on, Katie, one moment. I forgot some logistics. We have a poll. Please answer it. We're going to pull that up right now. You can answer that, and we'll just tune things a little bit as we go. And if you have questions, which we hope that you do, because they're going to spur a more lively discussion. If we have questions, please put them in the Q&A. That's a little more public, and some other people can see what you've asked. You can, of course, chat with us if you care to, but the chat only goes to us. So the Q&A kind of helps keep things a little more in this conversation. And yes, my kids are in the background as well. They may be making a joyful noise too. Who knows? So let's proceed. Katie, take it away.
Thanks. I'm glad that it's as joyful as it is. I hope that there's some sort of Pavlovian association where people think about like school, and then they hear this like giggling in the background and they think of it as a joyful, happy thing. But going back to sort of preparing for school, I think one of the main things that I'm going to be talking about is digital organization. So a lot of you guys at home might be moving between houses, or you might be remote for part of the time and hybrid for part of the time. And one of the things that I noticed students forgetting or losing are, calculators or notebooks or pencils or Apple pencils or the iPad. And so one way to like sort of reduce the amount of the cognitive load that you might have would be to have things in a centralized place digitally, so that you can transition between these different spaces. And I'm just going to share some slides real quick about good computer habits. So keeping everything digitally centralized, Google Drive is a great place for this. Many of you are probably already using that. Having your folders organized by class. Another thing that I find really useful is using Google Sheets for flashcards. Some of my students don't know quite how to use this. So the way that you might set this up is if you go into Drive and choose Sheets. Oops, sorry. Here we go. Nope. There we go. If you go into Drive, you can select New, and then you get this drop-down menu, and it will say Google Sheets. And if you click that, you can set something like this up. So here we have, this would be like for a freshman year biology class, or sometimes it's junior year. They've been changing it up lately. I've been noticing a lot of physics being taught freshman year. But here we have Phylum. So this is the different ways that you might categorize organisms. And then we have different aspects of those categories. And sometimes I'll see that a student will create like a flashcard, a giant flashcard, where they'll have like one thing on the front, and then they'll have a huge list on the back. But I like this setup of sort of arranging cells and columns so that you can start to see like the different things that that might be shared and the things that might be different. And just that act of restructuring the material that you've been given is really helpful and can go a long way towards supporting your understanding of that material. And if this feels confusing in terms of how do I set this up, it can be something that you can talk to a parent about. One of us might be willing, might be happy to help you with it. But I think that having also like the spatial organization of it is helpful. I've been doing this also with my, I know this is earlier than most high school students, but some of my IC and SSAT students have created Google Sheets with vocab words, and they'll remember a word based on the location on the sheet. So they'll be like, oh, I remember upper left-hand side of that sheet was innocence. So that must be what that word means. So it's kind of nice to have that, that added visual component.
Yeah. It's worth noting, just from pedagogical and even psychological research, that anytime you are processing something, whether that's typing it into a Google Sheet or writing it out into a notebook or writing it onto a handwriting recognition app on your iPad or whatever it is, all of those moments are moments that help reinforce that knowledge in your brain. There's no easy way around it. You're doing the work, but when you do the work, you're actually reinforcing how that stuff lays down its tracks in your memory. So it is worth the time spent to build something like what Katie's advocating for. Dorothy, what's your take on organization? How are you working on this with your students?
The Google Sheets method that Katie was talking about is such a good way to organize like information, especially for things like biology, that is going to be so like there's vocab words in the definition of vocab word, things like that. And organization is such a new concept for a lot of kids going from middle school into high school too. I think a lot of times they're they are coasting by, they don't have to do as much work, and then suddenly the workload is super hard because now you've hit 9th grade or 10th grade and you haven't been organized this whole time. You haven't had to yet. So using a planner, using Google Calendar, all of that are going to be really great tools to use. Starting early is also really helpful because it's just going to translate and be even more helpful later on down the road in your high school career and even further on into college. I have a student who I had in 8th grade who would lose his homework all the time somehow. I would say, where'd you put your homework? He'd say, I put it in the bottom of my backpack. I'm like, okay, well, how about we put it in a folder next time? And he's like, well, I lose my folder all the time. It's like, okay, well then let's make sure we don't lose our folders. And after some time, that habit became useful because he didn't lose his homework anymore. I had him take pictures of his homework so that at least there's a digital copy if he did lose the physical copy. And now that he's in, I think he's going into 10th grade now, he's really organized. He actually schedules stuff with me when he knows he's going to have a test for. He's like, well, Dorothy, I've got a test on Friday, so I'm going to have to see you at least once more this week. And he schedules that himself. So really, really great now.
That's
A
awesome.
lot less hand holding. So yeah, good computer habits, good classroom habits can be super important.
Something that I saw, which really drove this home for me, was a student in 8th grade who the parents called us because the student was having trouble in math, and the math was becoming a real sore spot for him, and he just wasn't understanding anything. But as I started to work with him and dug into his workflow and what he was doing to process the things he was getting from the school, I realized that the problem was actually the organization, because there was so much information coming at him that he was shutting down. And just handling his homework and where it was coming from and how to organize it and how to respond to it, that was overwhelming his cognitive load. So he had nothing left to grapple with this math, which was confusing for him. But when we were actually able to isolate it and only work on the math, it wasn't a problem because we had sort of handled this organization stuff. So I can't speak enough, we can't speak enough about how important it is to get the workflow down so the student's brain can focus on the challenging stuff of learning, recalling, and problem solving. Dorothy, you mentioned classroom habits. I know, Katie, you've got some stuff to talk about in that regard. Please take it away.
Sure. And I love this idea of like having a place for each thing. I think it's so useful. Something that I learned about in a training for Schefter was the use of a pencil portal, which I think is so funny, but this is for a bit of a younger grade, but they basically would take bubble milk tea straws and like tape them to the desk, and students stopped losing their pencils. So I feel like just having like a designated space for your pencil can go a long way towards just a designated space for things in general. But in terms of good classroom habits, I think even though it's so helpful to have things like digitally prepared, if you're taking notes, I find it so helpful to take notes by hand, whether you're in a remote setting or in a hybrid setting or in person. Actually physically taking down notes is helpful just because you get that like kinesthetic learning component to things. I also feel like it's really important to ask clarifying questions if things feel unclear. It's hard to read students' faces. When you have a mask on, obviously you can't really see what my reaction is. You can't maybe even tell if I'm like smiling or reacting to you. As a teacher, it is uncomfortable when you're in front of a sea of students and all you're getting is this. So having little nods in my class at FIT, I got one student who lightly applauded at the end of the class, and it was like my home run for the year. I don't think I've ever had a student applaud at the end of a class. Please applaud your teachers. And just, or even just like, like you kind of have to get really physical in explaining and in showing whether you understand or not, because your teachers are going to base their pacing. I base the pace of my classes on the feedback that I get from my students. And to that end, I think if something is not helpful, if something's unclear, the type of language that I really like to see is, can you explain that in a different way? And here I have a curious cat, which I'm realizing might suggest that you're going to die if you ask this, but you're not. Curiosity is a good thing. And it will, if it doesn't kill you, it'll make you stronger. So
it's very true. I mean, I think something we've learned a lot this last year from the digital, from the online format for classes, is demonstrating your presence as a student is vital to the classroom experience. A teacher sees and a teacher knows when you are checked out. So if you can be more present, even if it's just nods or looking like you don't know what's happening, that can help too, because at least then the teacher knows that you're engaged and you're trying to follow along. So this return to the classroom is interesting because we're kind of out of practice. This last year, a lot of students have been remote or hybrid, and we're out of practice with some of those kind of social components of the learning environment. And we want to talk about that as well. How can we use the fact that school is social, that it is an in-person, hopefully, endeavor? How can we use that to your advantage? Dorothy, you're going to handle this one first.
Yes. So it's been an isolating couple of years, I think, just from having to learn online. It's very isolating. And also the transition to high school can be isolating too. You've got a different teacher for every single class. And also each class might not have the same group of kids. So it can make someone feel like they're on their own a lot. And that's why self-advocacy is going to be so important. And some of my kids, they have no problem raising their hand, no problem asking questions, and that's awesome. But there are definitely some kids that I have who have trouble speaking up for themselves and also reaching out to others. A lot of my kids who are more successful have these like group chats in their classes. Like they have like a bio group chat, and like everyone that's in the bio class is in the group chat, and they're like they share materials, they share answers, they share tips on how to study. They also share like, hey, when's the quiz? Oh, tomorrow? Oh, okay, time to study, I guess. Things like that. And it's super helpful. I also, with a lot of my kids, help with self-advocacy in asking for not only help from their teachers, but also asking for validation for the work that they do. There are definitely many times when I have kids who get something right on a test, but it's marked wrong. Happens a lot. And so they're shy to confront their teacher about it. And so I actually help them draft an email to their teacher saying like, hey, I worked with my tutor, and we went over this problem. Seems like I don't know, I got this wrong, stuff like that. And just to, in a way, help them feel emboldened to ask for things. And yeah, so that's very helpful. And connecting with teachers, writing emails, like what I've been doing, building calendars, so helpful. And that's part of what we do here. Bespoke is like just sort of like the whole support system of that.
Yeah, I remember in my, I think it was either 10th or 11th grade Latin class, I forget which one, I had a friend, Doug, and every day when we had Latin homework, we would get on the phone. This was long enough ago that there was no video chat. We just get on the phone for an hour and talk through the Latin translation. And that, we were trying to do hard work. We weren't trying to copy each other's work. And this was something that the teacher had said was a great idea. And it was terrific that it made the work more fun to have this essentially a study buddy. And it made our bond closer and also made our work better. So there's a lot to be said for seeking out that kind of connection and making sure that it happens, even if your natural inclination might be to work solo. Katie, any ideas from you, either as a teacher or from your experience as a student or with students, on ways that students can work together to help this side of their academic performance?
Sure. I think that there are a lot of different ways that students can use their social networks to like support their academics. So, I think sometimes I'll have students that create an accountability buddy. Sometimes I will be that accountability buddy to a student, where they will text me when they get started with something, and then they'll text me when they're done with something. As well as, here, I'm going to go to the next slide about like centralized digital calendar stuff. Oops, I went ahead. Sorry. So I think that students will sometimes benefit from sort of being in a shared space. So even if it's just like on FaceTime or Zoom, working at the same time together and occupying that space and just feeling like that sense of collaboration can help, especially with papers, which I think can be harder to get started or can feel more intimidating. Sometimes with like math work, although it can be challenging if you're trying to work simultaneously or to beat each other at finishing something. Sometimes it can get a little competitive. But I think another good tool is to like quiz each other and have like group study groups. So for example, when I was at Columbia, we formed these different like learning teams, and we had this really scary professor that was very intimidating for all of us. So we decided to, in our study groups, to have very intimidating, scary study groups where we would have this thing called like the mouse pit, which I now call the mush pot to if I have a current class that engages in this, where somebody stands at the front of the class, everyone else has open books, and we rapid fire questions to the person at the front of the room, and they have to answer it. They have to be the teacher. And I think that idea of sort of flipping responsibilities and teaching your friends different concepts that you've learned can be a lot of fun and an interesting way to learn something new.
Totally. And I think this idea of trying to be creative, that's something that I'm hearing from both of you, is trying to be creative in the way that you are working with your friends, working with your peers for these classes. And something that's worth noting is that teachers recognize that. Teachers recognize if you are making an effort to engage, even if you're struggling, even if you're having a hard time. If you can be clear to a teacher that you are trying, that you are working at it, that goes a huge way in helping them know that you care and that you want to do better. So the next thing that we're talking about is we're going to dive in more on the digital systems, because this is a big piece of what we've learned. I talked a little bit before about how we've changed the way we understand our energy and our engagement. In a Zoom meeting, we have to pour our energy into the camera to help the people across that digital divide know that we're there. And I think we can take that lesson back into our real world engagements. Something else that I think is a permanent change, even if we could just snap our fingers and COVID be gone tomorrow, which would be awesome, but it's not going to happen. Even if we could, a lot of classes and a lot of schools, they're not going back from the digital developments that they have made over these last 18 months. They've really embraced a lot of these systems. And I think it's the way of the world that we and that students and families have to embrace them to stay up to date with these classes. Now, it's ironic because we're asking devices, computers, phones, and tablets, we're asking these devices that were designed to distract us, to keep us focused. And that is something we've all got to grapple with. And I know that I struggle with being on my phone too much. It's really hard these days. So we're going to talk now about how we can use these digital systems to our advantage for school, and some of how we can keep at bay some of the distractions, some of the difficulties of engaging with these systems. So Katie, I know we got that hint of that slide before. Let's go there now.
Yes, thank you. I primed everyone to know what's about to come next. I'm always curious what the sort of habits are of the people on the call. I know I'm not supposed to engage with you guys too much, sort of like don't stare at the outside the aquarium, but I am curious if anyone wants to hop in the chat or engage in the Q&A. If you wanted to share, if you have a centralized digital calendar and what you use or how you organize your stuff, that might be interesting for us to know. And you can always like private message me, although I probably won't be able to read it while I'm talking. But just wanted to float that out there. But I find it really helpful to have like a iCal or a Google Calendar, like a centralized digital calendar. And when I sit down with students, I'll make a list of items to be completed in a week. And then I will predict the amount of time that each item will take. I'm so excited because I see, oh yeah, something in the chat. It was just a heads up that the Q&A is there. And so we'll create a list of items, we'll predict the amount of time that each item will take, and then we'll schedule 30 to 90-minute intervals to complete each task. Now this like second option, that predict the amount of time that each item will take, I think it's important to think about how hard that is, because it's really hard to think like, oh, is this paper going to take me, 5 hours or 20 hours? But over time, you really do develop this skill. And that actually happened to me this week, I'm going to show, there we go. This is my schedule for the week. And you can't see it because I'd have it scheduled for later in the evening, but I had blocked off 2 hours to prepare for some classes that I had here and here to prepare the curriculum. And it wound up taking me 4 hours instead of the 2 hours that I thought it would take. And that's just something that I have to think about going forward. I might have to reevaluate how I lay out my time. But I wanted to show you guys this is my goal. This is what I would love for students to have. And this is a parent. I have childcare in here. I have my son's camp. I have different calls to insurance companies. I have laundry. I don't know if that's on your agenda at home, but notice that laundry is in red. This color spectrum thing is something I really want to highlight, because the things that I don't like to do, or the things that are difficult, for example, I'm excited to teach at Schechter, but it's my first time teaching there. And so it's going to require more of an energy reserve to sort of build those classes and go there, versus the lighter colors, like the scavenger hunt with my son in the park, are indications to me that I have calm, serene things planned. You can't see it down here, but I attended a jazz performance on Sunday night. And so you see that I like to see a spectrum of the hard things and the enjoyable things. And this is what I would love for my students to create. After working for about a year with a student, this is what I got. So I just wanted to show you that there's, it's touch and go. This was January. So you can see that this is highlighted January 6th. Of his junior year. So we're just starting, it's the tail end of, we've just seen that semester through. You see that we have essay planning for finishing up his college essays. And then we have some homework help. This particular student had a lot of therapies that he did not want on his calendar. He did not want to put any kind of fun stuff in his calendar. It was important to him that it be only the things that he had to do. And because he had had so much difficulty in reaching the goals that he would set out for himself with me, this is a student that I had a very rigorous schedule with, and he would text me before and after each assignment. And I actually have, this is in my calendar. So I would create in a shared, I would share my screen and I would create the calendar for him. This is what's coming forward. This was our prospective week. And then we would do a retrospective at the start of every session. And we would, in the brown, you see, we would show what he actually did versus what he intended to do, so that we could map those things together. And what was really nice is that if I had a point to bring up with him, hey, I think you're staying up kind of late, he might refute that and say, I'm not staying up late. It's totally fine. I've been going to bed at a normal time. And I could go back 4 or 5 weeks and say, look, 5 weeks ago, you were going to bed at 9. And here, the past 3 weeks, I see that you're going to bed at 11. And you'd be like, oh, you might have a point. So it's just a nice way for if there is a difficulty, if a student's having a hard time sort of tracking their time, it can be really helpful to have another set of eyes on that, and to have the sort of evidence built in over time, so that we can have a conversation about it, and everyone can have a more realistic kind of expectation of what to expect going forward.
Yeah, this is key. And I think something we've established as a really key part of any kind of academic support or academic coaching. And it's not just what a tutor does. It can be what a student does on her or his own, or what a parent does with a student, is a dedicated time set aside on a Sunday or a Monday, kind of at the start of the week, to look back and look ahead and say, what have I done and what do I need to do? And as Katie said, break it down, where you're not just saying, I've got a paper due then and a test then, but you've got to say, what are the steps that I need to complete to get there? Because if you can have that dedicated moment, for many students, it feels like a waste when they're doing work. They want to just be doing work. So they want to be getting right into their math book, or start writing their essay, or start studying for their chemistry test. You've got to take a moment where you're just working on your work. What will I be working on? Because then you can triage, which is essentially where you choose what's most important and how much time should those assignments get. Dorothy's going to talk to us a little bit more about work and this change in high school. Dorothy, take it away.
Yes. So, as you can see here, you better work. It's it's a transition. I understand a lot of my eighth graders. I mean, I mean, you can be super super smart, but just relying on intuition is not gonna cut it. Once you get into high school, it's kind of a wake up call because the content is going to be a lot harder, and it's always going to be a step up every time. Like it's going to be harder from ninth grade to 10th grade, 10th grade to 11th grade. So it's just expecting that and now changing your habits so that you are prepared for working that much, and being more self-disciplined. I have a lot of kids who coast, and then suddenly they got all A's in middle school, and then suddenly ninth grade comes and they're like, "Oh my God, I'm getting B's. What's happening?" And it's like, well, you gotta do a little more than what you were doing before. Even my some of my strongest students, I had this girl that I'd worked with from like eighth grade all through 12th grade, and she very smart student. And in 10th grade, suddenly she got her first chem test back and she failed it. And she was crying. She was so upset. And then we're like, hey, well, let's take a look at this because she's a smart kid. And like chemistry, yes, it can be a little complicated, but we took a look at what her teacher was giving, what his tests were looking like, and then from that be like, okay, well, he's the type of teacher that asks these type of questions. Let's kind of anticipate that for the future. Let's study in a way where we can figure out like how we can adjust to the way that he's teaching his material, things like that. And then getting a hand on that syllabus. I like doing that, getting a hand on the syllabus, and then not only teaching the material that she has to learn, but also going a little bit ahead so that she's not seeing the stuff for the first time when it is being taught in the classroom, things like that. And obviously she got the highest grade in that class that year. So yeah. But yeah, so building those study skills, working with somebody that can support you, memorizing skills, reading comprehension skills, that's going to take so much time. So yeah, discipline.
Yeah. And I think this idea of all of these things contribute together. The organization can be annoying, it can be building this habit, but it is going to help. Similar to the work, if you know how to work on something, even if you're having some trouble with it, usually that instinct to work, to dive into it, can give you a foothold or a handhold and give you a way to start on something that might be very intimidating to begin with. So we're going to talk about next fundamentals. This is another key piece of the high school picture, a big question we get from parents, whether they're parents of students going into ninth grade or 10th grade, or even 7th or 8th grade. Because we're a test prep company, they ask, what can we do to start setting our student up for success on the standardized tests? They're looking ahead to the SAT or the ACT in a couple of years. And our answer, a little bit old-fashioned, but I genuinely believe in it, and we genuinely believe it here, is the fundamentals. We don't advise that students start working on SAT practice problems in 8th grade or 9th grade. It's just not the right way forward because there's a real risk of burnout for these tests, and you really don't want to go there. So for those families, we talk about the fundamentals: reading comprehension, math, making sure you are super solid there. And there's a way to kind of add those things into the mix to make it a more rich academic experience, not make it a chore, make it more interesting, not only for your student, but for your family as well. So Katie, you're going to talk about this some, and then we're going to talk back and forth about it. Take it away, please.
Sure. So it's interesting, I had this whole thing planned, and I'm going to do that whole plan thing. But I was talking to a parent tonight, actually, and I realized this really important distinction about reading comprehension for a standardized test versus reading comprehension as a life skill. And that has to do with like the mindset that you take to something. So in most reading and writing classes, the work is generative. The questions are, what does this mean, or what might this lead to? Questions like, how many different ways can you use a brick? Versus the standardized test is, which of these is not a brick? And the which of these is not a brick, which is like the standard, I feel like, for all multiple choice, the process of elimination that you're using to get rid of wrong answers is a much more sort of narrow way of thinking, and can be more frustrating for students, I think. And so what I like to talk to families about, what I like for them to work on as a family, so that the student isn't getting too burnt out on this whole process, are the generative aspects of reading comprehension. And so I really encourage families to watch films together. I love watching shows and movies with my son. And, I'll pause the show in the middle of it and say, what do you think is going to happen next? Or how do you think this character feels? Because these are really important aspects of reading comprehension that can be fun to talk about, and can keep things kind of light. I think you can also ask broader questions, either through a show or just in general, like, what do you think makes a person successful? Who's the most powerful person in the world? I taught a back to school essentials class over the summer, and part of it involved these like executive functioning skills. And the first paper that I assigned, I had sort of staggered deadlines so that we could work on calendar formation. But the first paper that I had due on a Tuesday was, what does it mean to be a successful leader? And I read paragraphs from each of my students on what makes a successful leader. And then on Thursday, we talked about, what does it mean to be a successful person? What does it mean to be successful? And they wrote paragraphs on that. And then after they submitted that paragraph, they were assigned to watch The Fog of War, which focuses on McNamara, the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. And we got to have sort of a class discussion about, based on what you think a good leader is, based on what you think it means to be successful, do you think the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War was a successful leader? Would he consider his life to have been a success? And it was this really interesting conversation where some students would say, well, of course he was. He was the president of the Ford Motor Company. He was the Secretary of Defense. He went on to be the president of the World Bank. And then at the same time, it was like, oh, but he was not beloved. He made some very poor choices, or, things. He wasn't necessarily well regarded. So it was just this interesting sort of conversation to have. And I really love the idea of families just spending time together and enjoying like the curiosity and enjoying the act of learning together. And I find with students, especially if they're starting to get frustrated with the rigors of high school or with science, that being asked about their opinion is such an important way to give them a sense of their voice, and to help them to develop more confidence.
Absolutely. And my daughter is reading Nancy Drew books, which obviously are not the most elevated literature, but they're great. She loves them. And I'm taking a quote that Katie mentioned when we were working on this webinar. I'm changing the context a little bit, but the quote is, start with curiosity. And I think that's such a vital phrase to take forward into the idea of reading comprehension, and of really kind of grappling with the things that your child is grappling with. That if I can ask my daughter questions about Nancy Drew and learn a little bit more about George and Nan and Nancy, and just kind of dig into that world with her, that resonates because it's rewarding the thing that she's finding exciting. People talk a lot about reading comprehension or doing your reading as a chore. I think you've got to find a way past that, because you've got to reconnect with the passion of what you are reading. Also on the topic of fundamentals is math. Even for the math and science sections of these standardized tests, they are still reading tests, because you've got to read the question, figure out what it's asking, and then do the math to solve it. So something that, again, is old-fashioned, but I can't stress enough, is things like times tables, memorizing shapes, figures, and formulas. Because on these tests, and as math classes get more difficult as high school goes on, you are, rightly so, being asked to do problem solving. There's new information, it's put together in new or challenging ways. So the real difficult part of solving those problems is understanding all of that. If you or your student is spending too much time trying to remember or trying to figure out just quickly what 8 times 8 is, then they're already using their brain's energy, their cognitive load to do that. And they're not going to have as much left over for the actual problem solving, the challenging part of that problem. So I think in 9th grade, in 10th grade, you've got to keep an eye on your math and make sure you're stronger on it than you might be generally okay with, because it is going to mean a lot more as time goes on. Now, these are all big changes that we're talking about. Changing habits, changing behaviors, making a new scheduling life for yourself. It can feel very daunting. And we want to talk to that as well, because that's something we deal with students, with parents. Dorothy, can you talk a little bit about kind of this time scale of change and what you've seen from your students as they try to make these changes and incorporate them?
Yeah, so one of the biggest thing to remember is that progress is not linear. So these changes are going to take a lot of time. I feel like the majority of my students who are very successful in reading comp, in um, um, critical thinking, things like that, that takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of reading. And you can't just read a book and say, all right, now I'm great at it. That's not going to happen. You're going to have to do it over and over and over. And I've learned that the hard way because my parents don't speak English at home. So a lot of where I've learned how to think critically and not think like reading comprehension, especially with English, is going to be reading a lot of books. So I did that a lot. And this will require lots of reminding. I think a lot of kids, I'll help them create a schedule. We'll parse out time for math, for English throughout the whole week. And then they'll follow that schedule for like 2 weeks. And then suddenly on that third week, they've got all these finals and projects. They've got a test going on. They had a game that week. They also are having a sleepover. And then suddenly they're like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't really stick to the schedule this time, and I really procrastinated and I didn't do my work. And that's totally okay. That's going to happen. That happens to the best of us. And knowing that it's totally okay to fall off that wagon, you just got to get back on it and keep moving forward. Keep moving forward with that. And maybe knowing that that's going to happen, let's adjust your schedule for that. Okay, well, if you're going to have a sleepover, let's front load some of that work earlier in the week, and plan for changes like that. So having patience from their end, from the parents' end, from uh, and having self-compassion for themselves is going to be super important for just being successful in their high school career.
So true. I mean, something that I stress a lot in our tutor training and also in my work with my students is the phrase, big change takes big time. And a lot of what we're asking of our students is to make really big changes, to adjust the way that they work, to adjust the way that they think. And that's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen just after watching a webinar and then being able to go and flip a switch for school next week. It's just not going to happen. So really being able to say, this is what we're working towards, but any element of progress that we see is to be celebrated because we're getting there. These are big changes. Katie, we got a question in the chat about procrastination. How are you responding if you see a student who has difficulty with procrastination, who's pushing back on the schedule? They have the schedule, but then they don't do the thing. Do you have any advice or any thoughts for how you might grapple with that with a student and with his or her parents?
So I think it really relates to what I think that an important question is to ask: what is the source of the procrastination? So what is prompting it? And most students are pretty comfortable talking about that. And I find that that's I actually had my son has like a friend across the street, and his older sister was actually delaying her work on a summer project. And I could feel this tension rising between her and her parents, because they kept being like, you just got to do the work, just like sit down and do it. And sitting with her and saying, so what is it that's causing this to be so difficult? I found to be really helpful in terms of her sort of walking me through like why it was difficult, or, was it hard to get started or hard to keep going? And she said it was just hard to keep going. And then I was able to suggest different things. So some students need absolute quiet. And so they might need the support of the family to really have like a quiet, secure place. I've had students who, while they're studying, will go to like a neighbor's house who's out of town or something like that. Like they need the private, quiet space. I have other students that really need sound. And I have different apps that I've suggested. There's an app that I use called Endel, Endel, which plays sort of like these soundscapes, and it's developed by artificial intelligence, and somehow it tracks like a typical circadian rhythm, so that, and you can choose different sounds according to the type of task that you're working on. So they're like chores tasks or deep work tasks. And I swear that app helped me so much with homeschooling during the pandemic as a parent, because it just has this sort of level sound behind it. And I could do dishes, and then I could change it, and I could do, writing or different things. And so that student actually wound up using that app to help her complete the project. So I feel like that's one thing. And then the other thing that gets a lot of kids stuck is perfectionism. They're like, I just want it to be, I know that it can be so good. I really want it to be so perfect. And for that, I feel like it's really important that they get started, that they get a draft done. And so that's where the collaborative work comes into play. And I find that having someone else like walking them through it, whether it's a tutor or whether it's a friend that they're just like on the phone with while they're writing, is helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. We had another question just now about helping students deal with online distractions, things on their computer, on their iPad, getting sidetracked onto YouTube when they should be researching something. I'm going to take a first stab at answering this. Katie, Dorothy, you can think about it if you've got anything to add. My big note is to put it down and put a timer on it. This is something I've done actually for myself to get a handle on my phone usage, is just saying, check my phone, and then I'm going to set a 20-minute timer and turn my phone over. If I need to, I'll put it in a box in the other room or whatever it is. Same for the computer. Find something that you can do that is off the computer, whether that's reading a book or downloading the PDF, printing it, and then reading that in hard copy. But finding some way to not be on the device, it really is about training the brain to not need that kind of stimulation. It's a hard change to make. It's something that many people are grappling with. But I found that those bite-sized chunks of time, even if it's you start with 5 minutes or something really manageable, you're really training your brain to be without that kind of distraction. And I think it does come down to setting a timer and then really maintaining that discipline. Katie, Dorothy, Katie's got something. Go for it.
Well, I love what you just said, and I think it's so helpful. It's such a helpful suggestion from the perspective of the person who is like struggling with managing their screen time. I find there's also sometimes a challenge in terms of a parent trying to tell a child, hey, it's time to put down the iPad, or you really need to focus on your schoolwork, and the child not feeling like that they're not having that kind of like self-initiated sense of control. And so I've been in a lot of these situations with families. It can get really messy. I mean, I want to say, first of all, I sympathize with it. I think it's a really tough thing to navigate. I've done things where I've created like, oh my gosh, what is it called? Behavioral contracts. I've created, or I'll facilitate a family creating behavioral contracts where it requires, contribution on the part of the student. And usually students will say, I want to just be in control of my time, and I'm an adult, or I'm almost an adult, and I want to be able to manage this myself. And the conversation that I usually have is, well, if you want your parents to take their hands off of your wheel, you need to have both hands on the wheel. So how are we going to, collectively, how are we going to monitor whether or not you're going to crash or whether or not you're on track? And then we try to make a plan. It's like, sometimes it can be, if you get all of your work done in a day, then you get some sort of like reward. Or I had one student where I would text the family at the end of every night to let them know if the student could have dessert or not, which is a little bit more, hands-on. And obviously that's something you need to work out with the tutor, whether it's like more of a high five or whether they're holding your kid by the wrist to like help them through. But I think the really important thing to know is that when you create a behavioral contract with a teenager, that contract is not a question of will it be broken? It's a matter of when. And so you have to have consequences built into that contract. It's not like you have to do this from now on. It's like, when you sign off of this contract, this is the consequence that will happen. And ideally it's realistic. It's sort of like what would happen in the real world if you were caught at work on YouTube, or if you were, so it might be, you lose some sort of privilege or some sort of opportunity. But I feel like it's helpful to kind of zero in on the specific situation. If you want to ask a more clarifying question, or more specific question, I'm happy to answer. There's a lot of different things that can be done to support that.
And there are tools and apps that track screen usage. That is something that can be useful to sort of help somebody recognize that they might have a problem. Is if you look at the app at the end of the day and they spent 2 hours on YouTube, or 2 hours playing a game or something like that, and then show them to that and ask, is this really how you want to spend your time? You only have 24 hours in the day. That might spur one of those more meaningful conversations. We're getting close to the end of our time. I want to do some closing remarks from each of our panelists. Dorothy, can you close with anything that you just want people to keep in mind coming out of today's hour?
Yeah, I think it'll be good to be mindful, to be flexible with all the changes that are going to happen, and that we're unaware of what's the future. So we don't know if it's going to stay in person. We don't know with the Delta variant if we're going to do some hybrid thing, or it's going to be all remote again. Who knows? So staying flexible and being mindful and having self-compassion and patience is going to be very helpful.
Yeah, and it's important to notice. One reason I love working with students is they're changing. They're such dynamic presences. It's a real pleasure to be working with a student who from the beginning of a school year to the end is almost a totally different person. That's just so exciting to see. So for those parents out there, just to remember that you are working with someone who is in a process of dynamic change, and that being consistent while in habits is something good as far as who they are and what they're focused on and what they care about. Those things might change, and that's okay. Katie, closing remarks from you.
I think the main thing when it comes to executive functioning stuff, I don't know if you heard that. The main thing is to do one thing at a time, do it well, then move on to the next thing. I'm still cracking up at him, but I think that's the central issue, is that when a student gets started on something and then they start to think about the other things that are on their plate, sometimes they can just get started, a bunch of times on different things and not feel very good about any of the work that they've done. So having a plan and sticking to it is really helpful. And I think having support in that is a really useful thing.
Cool. Thank you, Katie. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Bespoke is a word of mouth company. If you like this webinar, please let people know. We have more webinars coming up. We're doing the SAT and ACT. We're doing a deep dive on the ACT science section, and then we're doing the college essays all in this month. So please let us know. Write us at info@ if you would like to hear more about those webinars. And most importantly, call us. The consultations with Bespoke Education are free. They are long. And when we do them, we endeavor really to answer questions. It's not sort of luring you in to pay for that first hour of tutoring where then you're going to get the info that you need. We understand how many questions parents have, how many points there are along this road where there's something burning that you've got to know. And we really have a ton of expertise answering those questions. We've been doing this here, answering these questions for almost 20 years. So we know what you need next. We know what advice might help you along to the next point in your journey. So please give us a call. The phone number is in the chat. We're always glad to hear from you, and we're always glad to share something helpful as we have tonight. So please let your friends, let your family know, and be in touch. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you all and have a wonderful night.